and welcome to another episode of the Move, Talk, Thrive podcast. Today, Emily and I are unpacking goals, how we set goals for our clients, what we're seeing people struggling with, and how it might look a little bit different in different allied health professions. Let's set our clients up for success and ourselves up for success, and let's look at some goals.
We are child development obsessed, business besties, and mums, and we're here to spill all our secrets.
We have a combined 30 years experience working with children, and each episode we will bring you up-to-date research and evidence-based strategies to set your children up to thrive.
I'm Lizzy Dawson, Australian exercise physiologist.
I'm Emily Mackey, Australian speech pathologist,
and this is the Move, Talk, Thrive podcast.
Hello.
Hi, welcome to
Oh,
our
I love this topic.
Yes. Goals are that's intervention, right? If we don't
Yeah.
have goals, how do we know what we're doing?
I mean, I just love goals in general. We've talked about this before. I really like setting goals for myself. And then more recently, I don't think I realized in like a therapy setting that people struggle with setting goals until I revised it in my team. And I was like, wow, we're actually not setting ourselves up for success here. We need to revise these goals. Then we can be doing better here.
And I think that's the same with me. I didn't realize that people were struggling with setting goals, like clinical goals, until I was sort of just mapping out, like thinking about the process of assessment to therapy. And I was thinking about what kind of resources can I put out to help speeches. So I put a resource out in terms of how to select the right goal to start in therapy. And like over 250 people on Instagram commented saying they wanted the link. And then we did a webinar and people were like, we need clarity around this topic. I was shocked, but also really happy because it's good that people are saying like, we need help with this area. But I was like, this is such an important thing that you need to know. How do you choose which goal to target, when and why? But I think particularly at the start of the journey, when a client comes in, where do you start? Because you've identified, oh my gosh, they've got all these areas of difficulties, all these different needs. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And it is really good, obviously, having an EP and a speechy because there's different perspectives and pathways to take.
Yeah, well, I think when we were planning this episode, we realized pretty quickly that we do it differently. And you know what? I don't know why we're surprised that people can't do goals very well because, like, generally speaking, even personal goals, people really struggle with it.
You're
And
really good. You've become really good with goal setting. I always
love it.
You.
I just love it. And I think, I think because I like to achieve things. And so I need to work out what that looks like, what success looks like, what I need to do to, make progress in it. And then how I like that, what success looks like how am I measuring it? And this is no different to a therapy goal. So if people are struggling with this in their personal life, of course they're struggling with it in therapy. And so I think it needs to be specific. I think it does set up our intervention. I think it really identifies what, we need to work out, okay, we need to, the child needs to be achieving this, or this is our therapy goal. What do we need to do? So I've got a question for you because you're going through your journey with the goal setting, and I'll share mine. But what are you finding that people are specifically struggling with when it comes to goal setting?
Well, a few things. I think being specific with the goals. A lot of people use not old school, but the most common framework is SMART goals, right? So like make it specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and what's the T?
Time.
Time. So I think sometimes people forget about all of those elements. But also, recently I've been reading a book on coaching and performance, and they actually talk about SMART goals aren't amazing and helpful. And they have a different framework called GROW, which is the GROW model, which is the goal, the reality, the options, and the will. So I think sometimes it's like not knowing like the framework, or it's not knowing how to apply that, and then they're too broad with their goals. So then it's the goal is meant to give direction to what you're doing, so it's not specific enough. But I feel like if you then go a bit out of that, people make it people aren't specific because the clinical skills and the clinical reasoning isn't there, and it's not strong enough yet. And so for new grads, like that's totally understandable. That's why you get a mentor to help you make specific goals. But also, like some of the clinical areas that we're working with can feel vague. So we need a little bit of help. We need to do a bit of PD with the clinical areas to know.
Yeah.
I think as well, sometimes it's a bit of overwhelm and a bit of competition with areas. So I would assume with EPs, you have lots of different areas like you need to work on. So with speeches, a child comes in, it's like, right, okay, they're stuttering, but they've also got language difficulties, and they've also got pronunciation difficulties or articulation, phonology issues. What do we target first, and how and why and when? So
Yes.
and again, that comes back to clinical reasoning,
Yeah.
but get stuck in a bit of overwhelm. And so sometimes then that can also be why our goals are very broad, because we think, all right, we'll just target like the top layer of this goal and try to do too much at once.
Yeah.
So it's like quantity rather than quality therapy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's interesting, isn't it?
What do you see?
Well, I think, I mean, we use the SMART principles because I think it's just a really great way.
That's like the most common.
Yeah, and it's just like,
Everyone
okay,
knows.
is this specific? Is it measurable? Are we setting a time frame to it? Is it achievable? Is it really like, is it realistic?
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it's realistic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's just a really good way. Like when I'm looking at my team's goals, like we'll go through clients and I'll be like, all right, what's the goals? And it'll be quite general. I'm like, okay, how are we measuring this?
Yeah.
When is this, when are we expecting to see this from? And I also see that they're struggling with like, particularly NDIS clients. So you've got like a plan goal, and then you've got a therapy goal. And so that might be 12 months, but what are we expecting to see in the next, between now and the next assessment, which is about 3 months time? So I see them struggling with, okay, this is where we want to be in 12 months. What's a stepping stone to get to that point? Instead, I see them with 12-month goals, and the 3-month goals are totally different. Like
Yeah.
not even relatable. And to what you're saying, I think again, it's like that foundational knowledge and understanding of child development and how a child progresses. And so for you, that's obviously in language. We look at we kind of look at development as a whole, and how obviously the core strength and endurance impacts posture, and how posture impacts joint function, and how joint function impacts gross motor, and how gross motor impacts fine motor. And so, and how core strength and stability is going to implicate focus and attention and cognitive skills, and, you know, the fine motor skills of speech and language that you and I have talked about before. So I think having that foundational knowledge and understanding is like the starting point, so that you can look at a child, observe a child, and do an assessment and go, okay, these are the things that I think are happening, and this is the place to start. So while there might be a 12-month goal, really we need to focus on core endurance to begin with in the first 3 months.
And that's your clinical reasoning. So yes, I think you've just nailed it like completely, because that applies for any clinical area across any allied health professional. It's the way that I visualize it. I actually have put this, I have a freebie on my website, which it's an iceberg.
Yeah, cool.
yeah, you could do this any way you wanted, but I view it like it's like a timeline, or it could be a wall. Like it's like putting the bricks in. Each brick is a foundation, and you need to keep building it up. And if you miss a critical foundation at the bottom, you can't build the wall will fall down. So I think what you said is really important, because what people need to do is they need to really understand typical development. And typical development is not like smack bang at 6 months you should be crawling. It's understanding the windows for when development should be happening. So crawling, could happen from 10 months? 4 to 10 months is sort of like a big range there. But knowing at what age things are appropriate typically, because that's what you're assessing. You're assessing then to find the gaps. But then that helps you, set the goals, because then you'll go backwards, which is essentially what, when I'm talking about language, that's what we're talking about. We go down on the preschool language hierarchy to what is the core element here that we're missing. And we map it out. And so I've just done a webinar, which is on my website. I have a PLA goal selection guide, and we've done a webinar with that. I did the webinar working through how I would actually choose the language goal. And I even like cross out, like I mark things out to then try and highlight the goal. So that that's something that you can definitely look at if you're a speechy. But I think, so we've got different clinical areas. I think as well, we've got to then, so say, for example, the typical development, you see the gap, the next step in that is then taking into account the functional goals that parents have identified. Are they appropriate to what you're teaching, like to what the gaps are that you see? Does that align? Is it not aligned? You need to then draw the functional elements in, which we've talked a lot about power to the parents. We've got more episodes coming out about talking to parents, but we need to look at how does that goal then work with what the parent's saying, and how can we help increase the parent's motivation by drawing a functionality, like, what's the functional result of this to it? So it's looking at parents, and then I guess we have to know what the parents want by asking them smart questions and doing that in the onboarding process.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's about aligning your expectations, I think. And this is the place to do that. So what we do is we've got we're working with NDIS kids, we've got their NDIS plan, we've got the parents' goals, and then we've got our therapy goals that are going to lead or contribute to the parent goals and the NDIS goals. So I think that again, I feel like you've got to have that foundational understanding of child development to go, okay, to, like, for example, if behavior is in there, or emotion regulation, how do we determine, like, behavior is a really good one, and it's one that I do with kindies. So I go in, we're like, oh, we've got really complex behaviors. And I'm like, right, I'm going to assess where these behaviors are coming from. Is it that, they're cognitively struggling? Is it that they have no core strength, so they can't sit and focus and they're fidgeting and they're uncomfortable? Is it that their language, and obviously I don't assess them for language, but I can see if they're struggling with it, and then I can make a recommendation if they're not working with a speechy to work with a speechy. Or is it, that they're not regulating themselves? So it's identifying, and I guess the behavior piece is a really good one, because parents and educators are motivated to get the child's behavior right. But I know that the behavior is an outcome, and it can be an outcome of a series of different things that are going on. And so I think it's understanding that, being able to assess and measure and identify what's causing that, so we can then develop some goals and link it back to that behavior.
Yeah, you have to get the parents on board, but that can be difficult, because you might have to go like 10 steps before. But that's where the clinical reasoning comes in to go, okay, so even though we're working on this random, like it seems like a really random thing, it actually does align with the goals that you're saying or the behavior that you're saying. We will get there. And it's just really explaining that to parents and explaining, and like I find it can be helpful to have a visual chart. Like that's why I made the iceberg, or having a visual thing for parents to see, because it just helps you show like all the building blocks to get there, because it can be really far, the gap between what their issue and what they're identifying is to where you start with your goals. So I think with that, Lizzy, you basically have been able to form an understanding of those things as well by knowing the research. Knowing, again, this comes back to typical development that has occurred because of the research. But in terms of them choosing the goal, like, or the area that you would target, we then need to know, so if our goals are aligning with what the current research is saying is helpful on treating that condition. So for example, if I'm talking about language, you know, if I've got some littlies coming in, we don't know whether they will have developmental language disorder, DLD, because they're a little bit too little. But we know that if they're struggling with their language difficulties, they may. So the research says that children with DLD, as they're, you know, around that kindergarten, like 5 to 6 and above years of age, they struggle with word retrieval and pathways, which means accessing words quickly. So knowing that with the research, then what I might do is when I'm bringing my goals back to my 2-year-old or my 3-year-old sitting in front of me who has a severe receptive and expressive language difficulties, I might say, okay, one of the functional goals I'm going to choose first to work on is vocabulary and categorization, if they can't do that, because I know that that links up with creating strong pathways for word retrieval. With, if this child down the track develops and, you know, continues with this persisting language disorder, it may turn into DLD. So that's the research helping shape what goal I'm choosing now and why I would choose that. I also know that, you know, word retrieval is helpful then as well for forming sentences and grammar and, you know, putting understanding instructions. So that's that clinical reasoning component, which is shaped by research. And
Absolutely.
I think you would say that as well.
Research, I just think research has been so, and me, you know, just taking the time out to absorb as much research as I can has been so important for my confidence as a practitioner, my ability to communicate and educate. It's like my courses are riddled with research. Like I just love it. And there's more and more that comes out, because I think that if we, and I now send it to educators and not parents so much, but, you know, I think that if we can refer to research that, you know, what it, you know, links whatever we're talking about, it's really helpful. It, at least, at the very least, for our confidence.
Yeah. And it's important that we know what we're doing is right. And it has been, well, not right, but it has been proven to help. That's therapeutic. But research, evidence-based practice is a dynamic process. And it's something that you always need to be doing, because there's always new research coming out all the time. Like you said, things change. But the evidence-based practice, it shouldn't take too much time for you, because if you're keeping on top of things and knowing and reading things, then you should just be able to bring that functionally in to help your clinical skills. So you shouldn't be thinking, oh, now I need to consult the research and take an hour, you know, searching for stuff. If you have that scheduled in your diary to do a bit of, you know, just read through the most recent journals, or I subscribe to a lot of my journals, so I get the top headliners through emails once a month, then you can just make sure you stay on top of that research, so that you're having informed evidence-based practice, and that just helps you naturally shape your decisions, right? We've talked about our functional implications, we've talked about education, we've talked about knowing typical development, knowing that assessment of those gaps, knowing the research. Another big thing to consider would be the child, right? So their temperament, how they can be pushed, how motivated they are, if they are a child that can push through, like if they're struggling, if they need more the easy route.
Mm. What's their motivation, I think, is the key.
Yes.
Is it and this is a multifaceted approach. Do we, there's ways that we do it. We can role model, obviously. We can provide challenges, appropriate challenges. Problem solving skills, praise is another way to do it. And so I think it's really important to understand the motivator and potentially the motivator for the child and the parent, and then working out what therapy fits, what approach, I guess, to take.
And I think so I've had some children who, I can even talk about my own children, right? Like Evie, she is a real persister. So if she doesn't get something, as long as I'm encouraging her, like it's not in a harsh way, she will persist, persist, persist. So from a therapeutic point of view, say she was having issues with some speech sounds and I chose a complex target that she couldn't produce that yet. I could choose that complex target because I know it will generalize to 3 other targets, but I know it's really hard for her to get. But we might be able to persist with that. However, with my other little one, Isabel, she probably needs more the easier route first. So we need to produce a sound that we can do really easily, even though clinically it may not generalize because it's an easier one. But like that is knowing the child's motivation, but knowing which goal would be better first.
Yeah. I think that's so important. And where you can get that information, you can get that information from parents, because parents know, because they're constantly,
Have to do it
needing.
themselves.
Exactly. So what I find is a really important piece in our initial assessments, is we do a pre-phone call, like a pre-phone consult with the parents. And I think I've talked about this before.
Yeah.
I've got that whole process, that pre-assessment checklist as a freebie on my website. So if you want to have a look, I go through all the questions that I ask, and that is a huge part of us identifying goals. And some of those things is, asking about that motivation piece in regards to children, understanding their nature and their temperament, and how they're going to respond to challenges, I think.
Yeah, it's responding to challenges. That's it. Yeah. I liked
Some
what you
thrive,
said.
right? And some hate it.
Yeah. Also, as well, sometimes you also got to balance it with the parents. Some parents need to see progress really quickly. Other parents are like, that's okay. I already know I'm here for the long haul. I'm happy to, do this approach. I know that it might be a bit trickier because it will pay off in the long run. So you've got to also balance as well, like convincing the parent that therapy works. Because if you take a really challenging approach first, the parent might be like, this is not working, like this is too hard. So it's balancing that parent thing. But back to your checklist, we were having a chat like last week, and you were telling me that you asked them about their sleep and what position they're sleeping. I found that so fascinating. I've never really thought of that before.
It was funny. I was asking one of my team today, because she said she has had a sore back, and I'm like, how do you sleep at night? And she looks at me like, what? And I'm like, well, what position do you sleep in? Because it gives us so much information as to what's going on in the body from a postural, motor or muscle strain perspective. So I love to know what position people sleep in.
I've never even thought about that before. I always sleep on my side or my tummy with a leg up, I think.
I'm on my tummy.
Bent.
And I'm like hugging my pillow because obviously I'm tight through the chest. So I'm like shortening my chest. And then I'll have one knee up to the side, and that's the side, my hip, that I'm tight in my hip flexor. So it just it gives me so much information, because you're not going to sleep in a position that is uncomfortable because it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So it's
So I
just
guess
really good
it's
information. So that is something that I will ask people in that pre-consult.
and because then do you link it with physical goals with children? Like,
Well, it will help me identify what's going on, and where they are in that journey. Like, is the core strength an issue? Is the posture an issue? Because if the core strength is an issue, the posture is going to be an issue, but it's also you you need to be in the right posture to recruit the right muscles, for example. And we need that to be right before we can focus on joint function and gross motor skills. And that becomes before fine motor skills. So quite often, and I talk a lot to Lauren Dorney, who we had on for an episode, because she's an OT and she gets referred to a lot for fine motor, and it's when kids go to school and they're struggling with, I don't know, opening their lunchbox, writing their name, all of those little self-care tasks. And she's like, well, the fine motor is, we talk about how they need to go back to gross motor. And I'm like, well, before gross motor, they need to go to core strength. So that needs to be, and I think that's where those long-term goals and being able to break that down into short-term goals and communicate that effectively so that parents and, children, if appropriate, can understand the steps involved. And as practitioners, knowing the steps and then knowing for us, because we will determine those goals, and then that will then determine how we assess them and get objective measures in each session, which is really important. I say to my team, I need to be able to write a report from your notes. And so there needs to be enough measurements in every weekly progress notes to be able to write a report, because parents are going to need a report sometimes really last minute, and you need to have enough information in there to see a child's progress. And that's important, even if a parent is like, oh, how are they progressing? Well, let's have a look. We've got all this information. And I find the goals help me identify what measures I need to take on a weekly basis. And of course, what exercises or activities I include in an intervention. I just think it's the most important piece in the journey.
Absolutely. With speeches, I don't know, I guess this would be the same for you. I think as well, it's knowing the little micro steps, like you said before, bring to core strength. But with speechy goals, like language goals, we would have the goal. So say that might be to for the child to understand and use the word top in a sentence, like top and bottom. But within that, it's then getting really specific to what your cues are as a clinician to help the child step up and step down. And so stepping up means you're taking away help from the child so they can do it. Like in our industry, it's obviously so that they can listen to the instruction and do, or they can listen to the question and answer. Without any cues, without any help, without any prompts. And so that stepping up, stepping down is like you're then adding in all the layers of cues to help them achieve the goal. And I think people just don't really ever get taught what the step ups and step downs are. Like they're your micro goals to achieve a goal. And so you have the goal there, but it's like, but how? How does the child get there? And then those micro steps become your micro goals, because then when I'm writing my progress notes, which is what you're saying about measuring, I would then say, so my child understood top, in a two-word instruction or three-word instruction, four-word instruction with sign, volume, and intonation. So next session, I want them to do that without me using sign, without me using volume, without me using intonation. And that's my goals right there. So it's you're thinking about how you're aiding your child to succeed. That is your goals. And so with every single goal in any clinical area, you always have to have step ups and step downs, because you can't just expect your child to get it without, we always naturally help. And then we need to be aware of what cues we're giving to take that away. So it's knowing what those things are. And I had to figure that out a lot for myself as a new grad, because I wasn't taught. And I learned that through experience. I would be like, okay, so I'm doing this. The child has responded this way. They didn't get it. How do I help further? What do I do in this situation? So how do I step down more? Or the child is actually doing so well. How do I step them up? I don't just go to a new goal. I need to make sure I remove all the help, remove all the layers. And that's what I talk about in my teaching model, like teacher model, and then test. And I've got my hierarchies there of how we test our child and take those things away. But that is your goals, rather, like, as well as the development.
It's removing the scaffolding, isn't it?
It's scaffolding. That's what it is. Yes. And it's structure. And this doesn't, and so the structure, like the PLA, like when I'm talking about language, it works for structured learners, like analytical learners. If you've got different types of learners, it doesn't work as much for them. It might work at different stages. So it's knowing that. But if you've got a structured learner, the scaffolding is helpful. And that's what we talk about all the time. Like when kids are at school, they scaffold narratives and sentences and all of that. But that's your goals as well there. So if you don't know what those things are, that's probably why you're feeling a little bit in the dark with the goals. You need to get some help. So you run your sessions by a mentor. If you're a new grad, or run them by a peer. For the area of language, I've got the PLA, which we go through all those little micro goals. I'm sure you go through all of your micro goals in your courses as well.
Yeah. And it's like working out what your scaffolding is, and then when you need it and when you remove it.
That's right. And that's knowing the child, and that's how you measure progress, because you've got goals, measure, intervention, that's there. So I said, like, run your stuff by a mentor. If you've got goals, that's what you need to be having. If you're not sure, I guess even if you're like 5 years out and you don't know if your goals are right, you still need to run it by a mentor. If you're not sure, that's your gauge to run it by somebody. However, in saying that, I think with our professions like speech and movement, like EP, it's not life or death if you get it wrong, and you can change it.
Totally.
So you can pivot. Obviously, if you're a doctor or you're a speech, you're working on swallowing, different story. But, sometimes you will set the goal and you'll go into the session and go, this is the wrong goal. Be okay with that. Be okay to pivot. Be okay going, right, I'm going to learn from that. That was the wrong setting. What did I do there? Go back to your mentor and go, oh, what did I do wrong here? It's not life or death if you get it wrong.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of the process, isn't it? With like, and that's what I like I personally love about exercise phys. Like I feel like it's problem solving. Like you're setting a goal, and you might go down the path of whatever it takes to be on the trajectory of that goal, but you'll find out something else and you'll be like, oh, wait a second, the hip's tight, or that, glute med's not working, whatever it is. I was talking to my team recently, and there was a child coming in, low muscle tone, not on NDIS. So, and the parent, and we get quite a bit of this as well. Like a parent had brought their child in and said, oh, I want my child to be able to do a cartwheel. So that they can keep up or go to gymnastics and keep up with their friends. And so we were unpacking what the goal was. So that's the parent goal, right? And like, all right, so what does a child need to be able to do a cartwheel? Like they need to they need to be able to balance on one leg. They need hip strength and flexibility. They need flexibility through their adductors and hamstrings. They need shoulder function because they're supporting themselves through their shoulder. They need core strength. Okay. And then how can we measure those to see where they're at? Like the cartwheel's probably, a 6 to 12 month goal, depending on where they're at. But where are they currently at? Like, can they do a walkout and hold their weight through their hands and their shoulders without losing their posture? So it was really good to be able to look at something kind of not clinical and go, okay, how do we come back from this and what are our therapy goals? How do we measure progress on this? And what are the steps involved? Because that shapes the whole intervention.
Yes. Yes.
And like, this is why goals are really important, not improved social, because this was all kind of coming back to a social thing. But that was like a really clear marker, or like it was a smart goal, wasn't it? It was specific, it was measurable, but yeah, I guess it was measurable.
Because
It was,
the child can or can't do a cartwheel.
yeah.
Yes or no?
So yeah, that's right. And then it's really putting like, is it realistic and what time frame?
I think we have to really be, I'm going to say smart because we're saying smart goals, but we have to be, because that's what the NDIS is starting to do.
Yes.
And with all the changes with the NDIS, what the NDIS are putting emphasis on is functional goals. And so in looking at functional things, it's a lot of social communication, a lot of like, activities and sports and things like that. And so we need to be able to, use that lingo that NDIS is using and then work it into how we work as well. But that's what children are going to get funding for. That's what we're seeing. And that's the shift to more functional implications. So, you need to be able to, pretty much do everything.
Clinically justify what you're doing. Like you need to be able to clinically justify it. I was just on the phone to ESSA, our governing body, yesterday, because we've had some of our clients have their funding changed or revoked for exercise physiology. And shockingly, the reason was exercise physiology does not support someone with autism. And so smoke just came out of my ears. I saw red. I'm like, right, I'm getting on the phone. I got on the phone, and it was a really helpful conversation. She was talking me through what NDIS is communicating with them, and it was all coming back to the reports. Like it's how we are clinically justifying what we are doing and achieving. Are they progressing? Are they not progressing? And why? We need to be reporting with that clinical justification.
And so the thing is, you have to know the lingo, like the functional goals, but then we need to understand that 10 steps down the line, that's when we need to start. That's how we're setting our goal, but we need to be able to combine it all together.
Yeah.
So
like to link to their specific plan.
Yeah, in that lingo. Yeah. And so like we've said, there's a bit of a step process there. It's something that you develop over time, but it is really important that you know how to set goals for your clients, and also how you know how to pivot with your goals and how to plan your interventions. So we hope that you've enjoyed this episode. We have mentioned a lot of different resources in here. We will link everything in the show notes, but with the main thing is, I think if you're struggling, or if you're that person going, okay, I need more help with my goal setting, what resource would you recommend, Lizzy, like top priority from your stuff?
I think the pre-assessment checklist on my website is a really good starting point, because I think it sets you up for that first session to then develop the goals.
Yeah.
So that would be my go-to.
And we'll link that. Is that a freebie?
Yep.
Yes, it's free. We'll link that in the show notes. I think for speeches or anyone interested in language, I've got a freebie, the iceberg, which is all the stages of typical development, how that goes up. But then also I've got my goal selection guide, which is basically a template of running you through how to select the goals. And then I've done a webinar on it where I did a case study and we discussed, and I go through my process, my clinical thinking and reasoning to how I would actually choose a goal for an actual child, which was a case study. So I think those are good resources to start with. And then from there, you can sort of keep going. Obviously, Lizzy has her course. I've got my course, the PLA, which we both go through, but they're the bigger chunks. It's just if you want to, just a little starting point, we'd say start there.
And I think I was just going to say, in regards to the course information, that's like for mine, that's the foundational knowledge. So if you feel like you don't have that critical thinking, that clinical justification, that's a really good source because it's got all the research. I know yours is exactly the same. Yeah, and I think that's really important
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah. So we hope you've enjoyed this episode. Share it with your friends that are also, everyone's always in the same boat. They never say they are, but they always are. Share it with your speechy friends, your EP friends, your peers, and also share it with your workplaces. If your bosses are needing help with their mentoring, boarding of new grads, you know, there's lots of different ways to get the word out about the podcast. We love your support. We love you listening every week, and we will talk to you next week. Bye.